Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today we're headed to Fort Donelson, Tennessee, where on February 16th, 1862, Brigadier General Simon Bolivar Buckner, pictured here on the right, surrendered the Confederate Army after his commanding generals, Gideon Pillow and John B. Floyd, refused to capitulate and escaped with some of their men. Buckner met with Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant to arrange the terms following Grant's well remembered demand of immediate and unconditional surrender. News of the surrender spread like wildfire through the ranks of the victorious Union Army. Meanwhile, up on the very front lines, one of Grant's division commanders, Brigadier General Lew Wallace, he's pictured here next to Buckner, was as excited as everyone else. This was the surrender of the first standing Confederate Army, and it was won with a heavy loss and casualties. But Wallace was confused. He could see the fort in front of him with the Confederate flag still flying. Why hadn't the Confederates taken that flag down? As the Union troops with them closed in, ready for anything, Wallace waited for orders that the surrender negotiations had, in fact, been concluded. Wallace recounted what happened next in his 1906 memoirs, Lew Wallace, an autobiography. I want to read the relevant passage to you. As I'm reading, listen for mentions of Confederate General Bushrod Johnson, General Grant, President Abraham Lincoln, who happened to be a friend of Wallace's, various Confederate and Union staff officers, a naval officer, Commander Benjamin M. Dove, who reported to Flag Officer Andrew Hull Foote, and, of course, Buckner. So here we go. At length, the formation completed, ready to go into the fort, ready to attack. We stood ready to rush the entrenchments. Only why didn't the order come? Wallace wrote, at all events, the Confederate flag was yet flying over the fort, faintly visible in the dawn's early light. There, what's that? Said one of my party in a surprised tone. Where? There, coming over the breastwork. Two men rode over the parapet. One of them carried a white flag on a pole, lance fashion. Not caring to have my arrangement spied upon, I told Captain Neffler, one of the staff officers, to go ask what the flag wanted. Neffler, making haste, met the men before they reached the pickets. After a talk with them, he hurried back and reported. The bearer of the flag, he said, is Major Rogers of Mississippi. He brings a request from General Buckner that you refrain from further hostilities, as he and General Grant have been in correspondence about a surrender, and they have reached an understanding. The Major has a dispatch for General Grant, which he wants permission to deliver in person. This was great news indeed, news to justify a display of excitement. The report, however, not being altogether satisfactory, I went out to sound the messenger further. The introductions were stiffly ceremonious, in course of which it came out that the officer accompanying the flag bearer was General Bushrod Johnson. Do I understand, gentlemen, that the surrender is perfected? I do not know if a formality will be required, the General, Johnson, replied. With that exception, it is a surrender. Are you ready to give permission? Possession? Wallace asked. Yes. The troops are drawn up in their quarters, arms stacked. At this, I felt a quick thrill, which, if the reader pleases, may be set down to a recognition of an opportunity and an irresistible impulse to get there first. Then, it is now business. The General, Johnson, bowed. I lost no time, Wallace wrote. To Ross, one of his staffers, I said, go with the Major here to headquarters. Let him deliver his dispatch to General Grant. Tell the General also that I am in possession of the fort and all belonging to it. Then, to Staffer Neffler, do you ride to the brigade commanders and tell them to move the whole line forward and take possession of persons and property. Tell them to see to it personally that their men are kept in close check, that I want the business done as delicately as possible. Not a word of taunt, no cheering." The general looked at me gratefully. It's General Johnson, whereupon I asked him if he knew where General Buckner was quartered, and he replied, "I left him in the old tavern." "Well, if you say so, I will ride to the tavern with you. General Buckner and I are personal friends," Wallace wrote. "I have the highest respect for him, and it may be I can do him a good turn." My new acquaintance, Johnson, borrowed the flag from his associate, telling him, "You won't need it." Then to me, "Our people are in a bad humor, but I will be glad to have you go with me." And passing over the breastwork, I saw men lying in the ditch, dead and half buried in the snow, horrible objects to sight and thought. Here and there inside the entrenchment, the garrison stood drawn up regimental lines behind their muskets in stack. I noticed those we came upon closely. Many were wrapped in blankets, of which no two were of the same hue, though butternut and gray were the prevailing colors of their wear. They were mostly a thin-visaged set, angular, tall, light-haired, whip-corded. One had only to look into their faces to know what extremes of hard usage they had been put to, and how much society in general owed to soap and water, combs and towels. I thought they really appeared 2 or 3 trifles worse than their enemies outside. They eyed me sullenly, and several times it crossed my mind that I was doing an imprudent thing. We came to the tavern at length, a one-story affair, seen more frequently in that day than in this. I found myself next in a shallow hall, and stopping there, requested my friend to be good enough to give my name to General Buckner. He passed through a door at the further end of the hall, and, returning presently, told me to walk in. He did not follow me. General Buckner sat at the head of a table with officers, 8 or 10 in number, at the sides. He arose upon my entry and met me in the center of the room, grave, dignified, silent. The grip he gave me, however, was an assurance of welcome, quite as good as his words. Turning then to the table, he said, waving his hand, "It is unnecessary to introduce you. You know them all." I glanced at the gentlemen there, and one by one they came forward and gave me their hands. I had met every one of them 2 years before, when General Buckner's guest at the encampment of the Kentucky State Guard in Louisville. Their handshake was cordial, but they were not in a talkative mood. I understood their feeling and respected it. 2 of them had won my regard, especially Major Cassidy, Buckner's assistant general, and young Tom Clay. The latter was last to come forward. He put his hand in mine and, turning his face from me, cried like a child, and I could see nothing unmanly in his tears. The general then inquired if I had been to breakfast, and having answered no, he said, "I'm afraid you're a little late, but we will see." He called a patriotic sounding of the cotton field, whereat a Negro thrust his head through the door. "Another breakfast here," said the general. "What have you?" "Nothing except cornbread, sir." "No bacon?" "You've done it, had all done." "Coffee?" "Oh, a little water will rest up some coffee." "Bring it then." I had to interrupt the party in the midst of their morning meal, and we ate, and there was no apology for the commissariat. But nonetheless, I decided in my own mind that the surrender had not been any too soon. The talk became general about the war, more particularly incidents of the battle. It amused me to observe how honest they were in the belief that we had 50,000 men with more in hourly arrival. As an idea helped soften the pangs of defeat, I did not disabuse them of it. Once I said something to General Buckner about the old flag. I think it was an expression of wonder that his Congress gave it up for a new one. He brought his hand down on the table. "The old flag. I followed it when most of your thousands out yonder were in swaddling clothes in Mexico on the frontier, and I love it yet." The speech was not meant for retort. He asked me after a while, "What will General Grant do with us?" The question was of a graver moment than ever again, and I answered to the best of my light, "I can't say. But I know General Grant, and I know President Lincoln better than General Grant. And I am free to say that it is not in the nature of either of them to treat you, or these gentlemen, or the soldiers you have surrendered, other than prisoners of war. Well, he said, I thought as much. The only favor I have to ask is that I may not be separated from my friends here. May I say as much to General Grant when he comes in? Oh, yes, certainly, Buckner replied. In the midst of the conversation, there happened an incident in every sense strange. We heard a knock at the door entrance, and to the acknowledgement, come in, an officer entered, clad in blue, with gold lace on his cap and sleeves. Advancing towards the table, he observed me and stopped in evident embarrassment. Then, bowing, he said, I beg to be excused, gentlemen. With that, he abruptly walked out. General Buckner looked at me and asked, Do you know him? Never saw the man before, I replied. He's one of your Navy, so much is certain, the general said, adding to one of his men at the table. You had better follow him, Captain, and see that no harm comes to him. The captain hastened out. Now, the sequel gives an incident its character, making it so extraordinary that I choose to insert it as the text rather than a note. This is in his book. About 2 years after the surrender at Donelson, a uniformed gentleman came to see me at my headquarters in Baltimore. This is sometime in 1864. He introduced himself with a card. I am Lieutenant Dove of the United States Navy, he proceeded to say. You may remember an officer of the Navy entering the dining room of the old tavern in Dover the morning of the surrender at Fort Donelson. Yes, I remember. We were at breakfast. I am that officer, and ever since that morning, I have been in suspension. What for? I asked. At sight of the flag lowering on the fort, Captain Walker of the Carondelet, it's one of the warships, ordered me to land and secure the surrender of the Navy, to the Navy, that is, to him. I reached headquarters and was about to make that demand when I saw you, and, inferring your rank from your shoulder straps, I judged myself too late and retired, not wishing to have a scene. In that you have my offense. I see, Wallace replied. I was in your way. You were there before me, but you can now do me the greatest favor possible. What can I do for you? State the facts, that you saw me enter the room that morning, that you were there before me. Such a statement filed with the department will bring me release from suspension. Restoration to duty must follow. Of course, I gave the poor fellow the statement he asked for, and it had the effect anticipated. Probably no better example of the keenness of professional rivalry ever offered itself. So there's what Lew Wallace had to say about Fort Donelson, the surrender, and how we just managed to beat the Navy, commanded by Flag Officer Andrew Hull Foote, to have the glory of accepting the surrender of the fort. I should mention before I close that Lew Wallace is well known to you students of the Civil War, American literature, and classic movies. An attorney from Crawfordsville, Indiana, and the son of a West Point educated soldier, Wallace went on to be blamed by General Grant for being late to the Battle of Shiloh just 2 months after Donelson. Wallace redeemed himself in 1864 of a sort when he commanded Union forces at the Battle of the Monocacy in Maryland, where he lost to General Jubal Early's Confederates, but bought time for reinforcements from General Grant's army and General Meade's army in Virginia to come up to Washington and defend the city against a possible attack by Early. Wallace went on to serve on the military commissions for the Lincoln assassination conspirators and preside over the trial of Henry Wirz, the Andersonville prison camp commandant hung for war crimes. Wallace went on to a political career after the war was over. In 1880, as if that weren't enough, he authored the book Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, which became an Oscar-winning movie starring Charlton Heston in 1959. By the way, Wallace's study is now a museum in Crawfordsville, Indiana. I intend to visit at some future points. Take care. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War or Research Trail.